Hi everyone, this is Reefslider. Today I'm here to tell you how to use this special because I am unfortunately completely stuck with it. There is actually a lot to this special, and I think both how to use it and the counterplay is not well understood in the Western scene, so I'm here to try to break down about everything I can outside of these things. I'm not going to cover that whole mess in this video. That'll be something for another time. With that all being said, I hope this mini guide ends up helping you all. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy or become a member to help support content like this, and let's get started with the hitbox. So one thing that's very important to understand is where Reefslider's hitbox actually spawns from. Reefslider's explosion starts at the very bottom of the explosion, and it requires line of sight to hit the opponent. So this brings us to our first real bit of jank. On screen are a few images here where Reefslider does not hit the opponent. I'm using Flounder for an example here, but you can recreate situations like this really easily with small slopes or ledges. Basically, as long as you don't peek over the wall, you won't take damage if there's a slight bit of ledge difference or height difference, assuming you're close enough. So if the slider blows up a bit further away from a ledge, it won't get blocked as easily. Basically, you have to draw a line from the bottom of the Reefslider explosion to where you are. So if you know this, then you can understand how it might be very easy to avoid dying to slider in situations where it looks like it really shouldn't hit you. I don't know why the hitbox is at the bottom instead of like the middle of the slider, but that's how it is. So you need to keep an eye on that. Your lethal hitbox is actually quite small, but your 70 damage hitbox is massive. A lot of the time with slider you're going to be playing for trying to get a giant 70 hitbox on multiple different people for teammates to follow up on, so a lot of good Reefsliders are going to be looking to use as much of this hitbox as possible while getting around the fact that it's easily cut off both by the slopes thing I just mentioned, but also walls. One final thing to mention before I get into advice on using it is the explosion is opponent sided. It's treated like a bomb, which means for the explosion to kill, it has to hit the opponents on their screen, not your screen. This means it can be a little unreliable, and sometimes you'll have areas where it looks like it should hit, but it doesn't because for them, they went around a corner, but for you, you didn't. So, some advice with Reefslider. One thing to keep in mind is corners and diagonals. So obviously when you explode, people are going to try to go behind cover. One of the ways you can minimize that amount of cover is by using corners. So take for example, mincemeat zones. If I'm trying to clear this area on the left of the car, if I slider straight forward and blow up here or underneath, you can dodge the explosion very easily by hiding behind the wall and being able to shoot someone. If you slider to the left side, people can hide in the middle. So obviously if you go down the diagonal and blow up here, then neither wall works as cover and people need to go further away. It is a very simple concept, but almost every slider you're trying to do around cover should be trying to explode in this area, which means if you're dealing with a slider, you should know about this and be aware that that's how they're going to get around a lot of traditional cover that would work effectively. Another thing to note about Reefslider is grates. Grates are your best friend for this special. Remember that I mentioned the special's hitbox explosion is on the lower part, so it is actually the most consistent exploding above someone. So for example, on Manta Maria, I can explode on the grates, and not only am I hitting on top and below, but the hitbox won't get cut off by any sort of terrain because there's nothing to cut the hitbox off. So you're getting a much wider explosion, and you can also threaten to both blow up on the grates or slider down and blow up under them. And blowing up under grates is very similar. You can also hit people up top without things cutting off your hitbox. So it is the most consistent place to blow up in Reefslider, and it also gives you one more important thing. In my opinion, this is the most important thing to keep in mind with Reefslider, which is you want your path to have multiple different explosion spots. Eventually, people will get used to where Reefslider should be exploding, and this is the main way you mix it up. So here's another Manta example where I'm slidering here. This is the total paint trail of slider and where I'm going. With this slider explosion, I could blow up on the grates and hit anyone under me, blow up over here and hit anyone in the bunker, or go all the way in this corner and hit anyone on the street or anyone retreating the right side of the street. And because I have all of these options, the opponents have to consider all of them. You can look for which one they're picking and try to punish it. Well, they'll of course do the same thing. They'll try to avoid you. But the more different places you have to explode, the harder it is for them to predict where you're going to blow up, and the more likely you'll find kills or force people into worse areas. Because if the opponents try to avoid every single location, that forces them here. This position of the map is rather weak when you're retaking. You're kind of cornered. They have top mid. You're going to give up your bunker, and you can get pinned very easily in this location. So finally, the last part of the explosion that I believe is very important to know when we're covering the basics is an escape option. option. So remember what I said with the multiple different explosion spots, and we have this Reefslider on Hagglefish on this right side here. So from this angle, I can threaten to blow up in zone. I can threaten to blow up behind this block. So again, I'm using the diagonal to get behind cover. But the other option I have here, which is unique, if I slider and things are going wrong, I can slider down here. And because I'm exploding under this wall, it puts me in a really good position in cover. I'm still far forward pressuring them, and I can like hit over this ledge, for instance. Like this would be a Dreadringer position. So having an escape option that can pull opponents, you know, either to the sides of the map or have them turn around is very effective. If you play a Reefslider weapon like Tetra or Dapple, for instance, you can go directly behind people and use mobility to play around smaller pieces of cover, while Dread wants to do something like ledges. So it varies on the Reefslider weapon, but having not just explosion spots, but one place you can go that you can get away with your life and play a key position can also be very valuable if it turns out you have nothing to blow up. So the next thing I want to talk to you about briefly is the slider rail paint. This is a very small thing, but typically you want to use your slider paint to try and trap slower weapons. Think things like Range Blaster that have a lot of end lag, or something like Trizuka that can't easily paint under itself. You want to aim at them, pop your slider so that you paint under them, and then you can more easily slider and blow them up without them having counterplay. You do have to aim at them in order to get the slider rails, and it has a bit of travel time, so you have to predict it, which is why typically it's better to go for slower weapons that aren't going to be able to move out of the way more easily. Something like a short range shooter actually has enough time to paint under itself and move out of the way if it's close to cover, so keep that in mind. Next up, it's time to talk about the thing that gives Reefslider all of its jank, or at least most of it, and that is the actual slide. So first off, it's worth noting that when you slide with Reefslider, you lose your run over hitbox. So for example, if I aim at this dummy and I press slider, you'll notice I go right through the dummy. I don't have the ability to do 220 on a run over. And this also applies to damaging things that aren't players. So if you try to run over a bubble and you pop the Reefslider and you press ZR, you won't be able to run over bubble, for instance. Stuff like that. Now, Reefslider slide is the same thing as the explosion. It has to hit on the enemy side, which means it's really unreliable. I would only go for it if you have no chance to explode the person you're killing, if it'll put you in a bad situation, or if you're trying to run over something like Crab that has a larger hitbox and can, you know, potentially kill them or break the crab for an explosion combo, but I'll get into that later. Another thing about this slide is that it has some guaranteed distance. So say I'm fighting a junior that's right next to me and they pop bubble. You can't actually slider to counter it unless you run over the rails, because even if you pop your explosion as fast as you can, you travel about 2 lines of distance, enough to put you outside of the bubble, for instance. So you have to be really careful if you're trying to explode someone next to you. There is only one way around this, and that is utilizing a whole other problem Reefslider has, which is that if you collide with a wall at all, you lose your momentum. If you need to explode right where you are, aim at a wall, because it's the only thing that'll actually stop you from moving, and that's how you can blow up closer to where you're actually exploding if you need to. Another thing that's worth noting is the slider's actual slide does not collide with walls in the same way. It can travel with momentum, and that allows the rails to lie to the opponent. So for example, here in this clip, if you look at this pause, it looks like my slider is going to stop before I get around the wall. In actuality, no, it doesn't, and 3 people die because the indicator lies to people. Obviously, when you fight people enough to where they're experienced and know these lineups, they'll be aware of it, but it is especially useful versus players who lack experience. Another example that people might know is the slider tech. It doesn't really have a name. Here's a good example of it. So here they pop a bubble, I pop my Reefslider, but as you can see, the rails are going all the way down, and that's because the rails show where you're going to travel if you don't slide. But when you slide, you actually gain a slight bit more horizontal distance, which allows you to make some jumps that aren't normally possible. So here, the Mint thinks that I'm simply going to fall down, but in actuality, no, I just get to kill them because I slidered over the grades. Oh, and be careful of Splash Wall. It can just completely ruin it if they time it right. Next up, I want to briefly talk about gear before we get into zone cheese, and that is special power-up recommendation. I'd recommend trying to fit 1.2 special power-up on most slider weapons, and not just for the reason you think. Yes, it helps with the 70 hitbox and the explosion on the zone, but more importantly is the 220 hitbox. When people are punishing your slider, a lot of short-range, more mobile weapons will try to be as close as possible to be able to shoot and kill you quickly. Remember, their shots have travel time, so the closer they are, the more likely they kill you before you can counterattack, especially if you play a weapon like Dread that has a lot of startup before it shoots. And so, Having a slightly larger 220 hitbox means they'll have to stay a bit further away, and you'll have a bit more time to either swim away, shoot, or cooler QSJ, which is another thing I'll get into when we get into specials. Next up, Zone's Cheese. I will briefly talk about this because it is relevant for a lot of weapons. There are a few things to keep in mind. First off, there are some stages that cap, but just barely, or can sometimes not cap even with a lot of special power. These are things like Marlin, Bluefin, or Shipshape, for example, where you'll typically want someone else painting with you, and you'll want a gear set that looks like this. This is probably the minimum you'll need for a very Zone's Cheese invested build, which means you're gonna lose gear perks on your weapon. For example, Dapples won't be able to run as much quick respawn, and Dread won't have swim speed. To give you an idea of how bad that is, imagine a Rapid without any swim speed. That's what it's like for this weapon. So if you're playing this kind of stage, you're basically fighting a weaker version of the weapon because they don't have that gear in exchange for the more reliable slider explosion. Outside of just being able to cap the zone, what's most important is a lot of things that I've already told you guys about when it comes to the first explosion. Where do you end up afterward? So, for example, with the multiple explosions, if I'm slidering the ramen zone, I can also threaten to go past them and blow up a common position where people have to paint the zone, so that makes it a little bit better. Even better is something like Hagglefish. If I slider off the right side of the tent, I'm gonna blow up behind the block on the middle of the zone, which means that people on the other team either have to hang back and push up less far on the hold, or I get to live behind there and can then annoy their team. Even better if it's something like a Dapple or a Tetra behind them. And obviously some zones you can get away with less SPU. Outside of that, when it comes to Zone's Cheese, try to do it as a last resort method to get the zone. A lot of times it is going to result in a waste of your special and probably your death if you're not tacticoolered. So it's usually not worth it unless you already have teammates down or no other option or desperately need more penalty points for some reason. But realize the fact that capping the zone does not substitute for the lack of map control, especially against more aggressive teams. Up next, some important special matchups. First up, Bubble. Ideally, run over Bubble, don't blow it up unless the people are very commonly clumped onto it. Like with before, if you can slider through it and have other spots to use your explosion, the more unpredictable it'll be. 2, Booyah Bomb. Booyah Bomb can get run over or blown up by Reefslider, and regardless of if you hit the 220 hitbox or the 70 hitbox, you will always leave them on 30 health. If they take damage prior, you can kill them that way. And if they are lined up in a way that you can run them over and then blow them up afterward, you can get a faster kill. Also worth noting, if you blow up on the outside of Bubble, even if it manages to break, which isn't guaranteed, you're not going to do any damage and probably die. So try to avoid that. Next up, Crab Tank. If you explode on Crab and you're not a really fast weapon like a Dapple, it actually has frame advantage despite the special breaking, and they can tank the damage by using ball form. So ideally, if you can't run it over, you want to try to blow it up from as far as possible. Finally, for HP specials, I'll mention you can easily run over or blow up Wavebreaker, but it's rarely actually worth your special value to do that. Two other important matchups are Kraken and Ink Vacuum. Ink Vacuum is actually a horrible matchup for this special. You can run it over, but it's inconsistent. It can tank your explosion damage, though not the paint. And even if you time your slider to hit them after their absorption is done, they can just shoot the floor, and that delayed explosion will guaranteed kill you as well and immediately paint over you. So be a little cautious with Vacuum. When it comes to Kraken, use it as an escape option. Preferably, you should go max distance and then over a ledge so they can't charge you. It can be a very good way to stay alive if you play a less mobile weapon and you're trying to deal with Kraken value. Finally, not a matchup against you, but Cooler. Because you are not in squid form, you can grab Cooler at any point in your slider. So you can literally slider and grab Cooler partway through, and most importantly with Cooler is quick super jump out. QSJing out of slider is very useful, and you do it by basically buffering the inputs. Once you hit the explosion button, you immediately press X, press the D-pad arrow of the teammate you want to jump to, and mash the A button. And then once you explode, you will immediately buffer a jump out as fast as possible. With Tacticooler, that is a 20 frame jump after your explosion. Very difficult to punish. Though don't get too greedy, because fast-firing weapons like Nautilus, Edit, or one-shot weapons like S-Blaster Charger can still kill you, so you gotta mix up where you're exploding. Finally, my last bit of advice is slider on other objectives. On tower control, you can tank for a tiny bit of time on tower, which can be somewhat useful, and you can also slider onto tower with some lineups, such as Undertow Tower after the second check, and if you time it with a bomb, that can clear the tower in overtime. On Rainmaker, it is extremely good at popping the Rainmaker shield. Try to space out your explosion a bit so you have two giant explosions that they have to worry about. And on Clam Blitz, You can clam blitz cheese with it, though it's not very great. And I guess on Turf War, using it at the end of the game puts out a lot of pain, mostly due to the rails, not the explosion. So it could be good to use in the last like 2 seconds of the match. And that is everything I have time for this video. I hope this gave you a better idea on how to use Slider in a bunch of different scenarios, and for those who are fighting this special, I hope that the better understanding of how this works might give you some better options at dealing with it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all later.